2012 is the 350th anniversary of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, a prayer book still in use in the Church of England, and one that has provided a key reference point for liturgies around the worldwide Anglican Communion. But before the 1662 prayer book, there were three major versions of the Book of Common Prayer, stretching over the Church of England's eventful first century after the break with the Church of Rome. The two prayer books, 1549 and 1552, were produced in the short reign of Edward VI, to be suppressed by Edward's Roman Catholic sister, Mary I. A year into the reign of their sister, Elizabeth I, in 1559, a third version of Cranmer's prayer book received the authorization of Parliament and Crown in an act of uniformity. This 1559 prayer book, apart from some small amendments under the early Stuart kings, was the prayer book for the majority of the Church of England's life and work from 1559 through a new dynastic reign and the cataclysmic events of the civil wars and interregnum, leading to the restoration of the Stuart monarchy and the Church of England in 1662. It was, among other things, the prayer book of Shakespeare. But I don't want to talk about a text per se. I'd like us to think about the impact of these texts, the first fully vernacular forms for worship for the English people. The Book of Common Prayer, therefore, has a social history, as well as what you might call a spiritual history, because the Church has a social history, as well as a spiritual history. During the first century of its existence, the prayer book was used, read, prayed, memorized, acted out by ordinary parishioners and their priests throughout the country. Although the prayer book was initially very unpopular and condemned for its novelty, not least for its use of the vernacular, as Elizabeth's reign progressed, conformity to it became for many English people the most important and defining touchstone of their religious identity and the religious identity of their church. Allegiance to a religious tradition shaped by the Book of Common Prayer would prove a powerful force in creating support for Charles I, who had been responsible for highly unpopular ecclesiastical policies when his three kingdoms erupted into civil war and rebellion. A rebellion fueled by polarized religious differences the king had done so much to foster. So in reflecting on the social history of the prayer book, the Reformation stops looking like a Rubicon, and we may question the stark before and after pictures put forward by some historians. That is to say, we have a story of continuity as well as discontinuity. Much change, needless to say, but there are real points of continuity in parochial religion after 1559 with its medieval past. The prayer book and the way it was used by the laity, sometimes in conflict with their clergy, is an essential component in understanding that story. Further, most historians of the 16th and 17th centuries now contend that the Reformation took a long time. Gone are the days when a textbook on the English Reformation could, as many did, end with the Elizabethan settlement. One might well say that the Reformation was only getting started in 1559. Religious change takes time to take root. In remote Cornwall in 1549, the first Edwardian prayer book was condemned as, quote, but like a Christmas game. Over a century later, another Cornish commentator was claiming that love for the liturgy, not love for the king, had made the county so firmly royalist in the Civil War. It is important to remember the relative brevity of Edward's reign, and the small window it gave Archbishop Cranmer and his colleagues to embed the first fully vernacular liturgy into the parochial life of the nation. However, if the 1549 uprising in Cornwall and Devon, sometimes referred to as the Prayer Book Rebellion, gives us any clues, even in the remote southwest, they had experienced enough of the first Edwardian book to know they did not like it. In a remarkable series of articles, these West Country rebels rejected point by point almost all the substantive reforms of the Edwardian Reformation, vernacular worship, frequent receiving of communion and in both kinds, the Bible in English, they were all decried by the rebels. Ironically, what many Anglicans and non-Anglicans alike have come to see as Cranmer's, quote, magnificent prose is dismissed by the Western rebels as but like a Christmas game, that is, conducted in the language of profane, not sacred activities. Now, it is not my intention here to argue for the uncontested acceptance of the Book of Common Prayer in the parishes of England following the Elizabethan settlement of 1559. It was a settlement that certainly didn't settle everything. The Puritan quarrels with the liturgy, its, as they saw, its residual popery and, quote, superstitious dependence on outward forms, these are things well known by historians. This Puritan mindset has never been more colourfully expressed than by an early 17th century Cheshire curate, who remarked that, quote, I am persuaded that the reading of common prayer hath been the means of sending many souls into hell. That might seem criticism enough, but the zealous curate continued, quote, that the Book of Common Prayer doth stink in the nostrils of God, and making the Puritan de rigueur comparison to popery, he concluded that the reading of common prayers is as bad or as worse than the mumbling of the Mass upon beads. Puritans complained of a catalogue of popular attachments to prayer book rites, from the observance of saint days, rogation-tide processions, communion to the sick, the sign of the cross in baptism, godparents, the churching of women, and baptisms by women, concluding, quote, which is a weariness to us to repeat, though not in you to use, tolerate, and defend. Ironically, it is these very Puritan complaints about conformist worship to the Book of Common Prayer which also give us some indication of its popularity and vitality. So as we approach the celebrations surrounding the 350th anniversary of the 1662 Book of Common Prayer, a newcomer after all, it is important to remember that it has been a dynamic and evolving text, as well as a contested text, one that the Church has felt right to adapt and reform over time and in changed circumstances. I talk about this more fully in the longer version of this lecture, but perhaps more importantly, the Book of Common Prayer became a common text, as is common worship, shared by priests and people, owned by neither.